Start it that way. Hi, this is Davin with Hagerty in our DIY series. Today we're with our 1969 Camaro. You might have just seen the video of the red line rebuild for the engine, and the motor is making a lot of power. It's feeling good, but if you notice at the end of that video, which is a link right here, then the link is over here, then you'll see at the end that this has a one wheel peel, which is all fine and dandy, but we want to make it a little more exciting to drive and purposeful. So doing that, today we're going to take and we're going to change out the carrier. This is an open differential, and we're going to put a Positraction carrier in, and then while we're there, we're going to change this anemic 308 gear to a 342. Now what that's going to do for us is that's going to give us a little more grunt coming off as acceleration is concerned, and then we're going to sacrifice a little bit of a highway cruising, but really we're only going to lose about 300 RPM. So instead of cruising at say 2,500 at 65 miles an hour, we'll be about 2,800 at 65, and that's not really enough to get too concerned about. Yes, big blocks don't like the high rev RPM for a long time, but we went through and we balanced that motor, and it should run nice and smooth at the higher speeds and not have any issue whatsoever. So with that, where I'm at right now is I've already pulled the wheels off. Now, let's be honest. If this is a job that is not that difficult, out of 5, I would put it at a 3, maybe a 4. There are a couple things that are very specific to do and this and that, but it's nothing that's insurmountable. However, if you're struggling pulling the wheels off, that's fine and dandy. This project might not be for you, but if you got it that far, you're going to be golden. All right, so I need to pull the drums out of the way so I can get to the axle ends, because there are C-clips in here that hold the axles into the carrier. And then there's also this cross shaft. So get the drums out of the way, and then the axles will be able to slide out once the cross shaft is out. C-clips come off, and then you can pull the axles completely out of the way. That way this carrier will come out. Otherwise the axles are holding it. Our tools that we're going to use today are fairly simple and straightforward. Basically you need some way to remove the wheels. In this case I'm using an impact. You could obviously use a hand wrench. Now you also have just a simple ratchet and some general hand tool wrench wise. You will need a dial indicator. The reason for the dial indicator is so you can set the lash, which we will get to. And then you need some way to put the bearings onto the pinion and the carrier. We're going to actually use a $50 oven we picked up over at a local box store, and that should get us plenty warm. They expand the bearings and they'll slip right onto the pinion. Okay, I have my brake drums off, and obviously I have the drive shaft out because the pinion is going to come out. I have to take the yoke this way, pinion comes this way, and I have removed the rear cover. Now, real simple. Rear cover is held on by 12 bolts in this case. It is up here. It is full of fluid. Pull out all the bolts, but what you want to do is, as you remove the bolts, have a drain pan right away. Just tip this out a little bit, let it drain, get all the gear lube out, and you have access to the gears that way. Okay, now, like I said, in order to get the axles out, I need to remove these C-clips that are in here. Now, in order to move the C-clips, I have to get the cross pin out because you actually push the axles in a little bit, and that allows the C-clips to drop out. There's a cross bolt here. And this particular one's a 1/2 inch. Need some way to hold it from rotating in order to get that out. And it's not a ton because it's fairly small bolt. Now, with the pin out, you reach up here and you can push down the cross shaft. Cross shaft pulls all the way out. So the cross shaft has this hole that's where this pin went in to hold that into the carrier. So the function of this cross pin is it holds the spider gears in top and bottom, and then also maintains the axles from coming in too far and the C-clips dropping out. All right, so the axle's in, C-clip drops out, and that's what's retaining that axle. Now I can come from this side. I can pull that up. Same thing for the other side. Now you may need a magnet to grab a hold of this as well. Now something I like to do just because is so the spider gears don't fall out, I put the pin back in. That'll hold everything together when I pull it out. We're not going to reuse the carrier, obviously, but it makes it a little more easier to handle here. To pull the carrier, it's just these 4 bolts that hold the saddles in here, like a main cap on an engine. This holds those in there. That's where the bearings are at. Now there's also shims between the housing and the carrier, and that sets that preload and backlash relative to the gear and the bearings. So to do that, just a ratchet. These are torqued in at about, I think, 65 foot-pounds. So it's not too bad to break them loose. Obviously, you're going to need a torque wrench to put them back together correctly. If I'm reusing this carrier, one of the things I want to make sure I do is keep the shims right to left as they come out, and then also the bearing races, because I want to mate the bearing races back up with the bearing that it was already functioning with. Just eliminates a potential problem with mismatched, call it mismatched parts, where they're broken and wore in together. All right, so here's our bearing cap off. If you look, it's pretty similar to what an engine has. Certainly not as large, but that's that. And this right here is our race. And then you can see one very large shim here, and there's probably a large shim and a smaller shim over on this side. And you do want to keep your bearing caps relative to the side it came off of. So this was here, like so. All right. Not a bad idea to mark them as well. And I will just keep them organized on my table for the time being. Now to pull the carrier out the rest of the way, again, I mentioned it has preload on it from side to side. So it's going to take a little bit of prying to get it to come out of there. And try to keep your shims together. And it's just as a point of reference as you go. Now, in theory, you got plenty of room and your muffler's not in the way, but we got just enough space. So this is how it's assembled. You have your bearing that's pushed onto your carrier. You have the outer race that just slides up into the main housing, and then this is the right side shim, and obviously your left side shim. Again, and we'll go through this as we go set the back of the other piece. GM has multiple ones of these size-wise, and they're always real, the big thickness take up all the gap. When we go over to the table, you see that we have a bunch of smaller ones and thick ones, because we're going to adjust this. We have a little finer adjustment that way, and we will need it because we now have a multitude of thick ones on our shelves. I highly recommend that when you buy your bearings, you actually buy it in a kit form. So when you get your bearings, you will get all new shims, both for the carrier and for the pinion, and then you get all your bearings and races and the pinion seal. You also get a gear marking compound and then new bolts relative to the ring gear, and a nut retainer and the crush sleeve, which we can go through that on the table as well, how that all laid out. But definitely buy the installation kit. If this is your first one, you might not need the installation kit the second time because you typically have more shims than what you need. But on the first go around, buy the kit. So here's our empty case. We still have the pinion in. I need to take my impact and pull the yoke off the front side, and then that pinion will push out this way. Okay, so there's a nut and a washer. The nut we will not reuse, but the washer we will, and that'll come out here it'll come out right with the yoke here. So a couple taps here. So here's our washer. Now, when I was hitting on this, I made sure I didn't hit on the ears. I hit on the beefiest section, which is right back here, and rotated to work it off. Now, this is a slip fit onto your spline of the pinion, but it does have a tendency to kind of hang on to it after it's installed with such force. And lots of times you also put a little sealer on here so gear lube doesn't seep up the splines. All right, the pinion is in and it has two bearings on it. One that's pressed onto the bottom of it by the gear, but then the other one's up higher, it's on the head here. And basically there is a little bit of it is tight. It'd take a little bit of effort to get the pinion to come out. To know what to hit out with a hammer and not is, I'll say by experience of, oh shoot, I shouldn't have hit that with a hammer. So note that I did not use a standard ball peen hammer. I used what's considered a dead blow hammer. So this has lead shot inside of it. It gives it a little bit of beef and it will not mar up the threads. Now, if I did not have a dead blow hammer, let me get this pinion out. If I didn't have a dead blow hammer, there's absolutely nothing wrong with taking this nut and threading it on and basically sacrificing the nut. Now you could bring it down enough to where it was, call it flush with the face of the yoke, or the face of the pinion, and then of course, hit out here. There's nothing wrong with that at all. You could also use a wooden block as well. Yep. Basically you want to, even though I'm not going to use this gear again, at least for this car, you never know what scenario you might have. And if you're using, let's say you are pulling it and you're actually just changing bearings, because these bearings will go bad on occasion, and you were going to reuse the gear, then you certainly don't want to kill the threads out here. This nut is a lock nut, so it does bite on there. That's why you don't reuse the nuts. And but you want to save the thread. A block of wood, a dead blow hammer, even a brass hammer, or at least a piece of brass in between the hammer and the thread would also save that. All right, now we have our carrier and our pinion out of the way. I need to knock this pinion seal out and then the two bearing races. So even though these bearings aren't all that old and the seal wasn't old, I got brand new seal and all the bearings in the kit, in the installation kit. So that's why I'm going to replace these. And of course, it's not a bad idea to do it anyway. Because just like Murphy's Law, it might not be leaking now, but it will as soon as I don't replace it. There's a little flat spot in here to reach in. On both sides, you could use a puller, but in this case a chisel, but a long punch works just as good. And you want to work your way around it, because as it comes out, it's going to want to cock sideways. And you want to take your time again and just walk it out nice and slow. so you don't mar up the bore. So this is the area in the housing that's been cut away in the casting so you can get a punch in to take these bearings, take the races out. Let's go over to the table and we'll show you what we got going on over here for the assembly end. So here are our brand new ring and pinion. These are a match set from the factory. What they do is they take and they run these in, which if you want to think about it is they're mating them together. So they're spinning these and setting them up. Now if you can see real lightly, I can kind of see where that wear pattern is at. It's right about here. It's hard to tell with the black on it, but with the light right, you can just see it. What we're trying to do is set it up into the housing, recreating that same exact wear. Now to do that, they've provided us the numbers on the back side. It says, looks like 2-inch, 871. So that is the depth of the pinion. So when you measure to the center line of the bearing caps to the face of this, that's going to be 2-inch, 871. So it'll sit in the gear like that, and you're going to measure here to here, obviously in the housing, and I'll show you that. For this, we have this brand new Positraction carrier. It has bearings up on it already, the side bearings. We'll go through putting the pinion bearing on using the same method. With that comes new races, and this is all the stuff that's in the installation kit. So you have the new races relative to the bearings. We have the new front bearing, and then we have a new back bearing, which actually is this one. Now this is gold because I've actually heated it up in the oven already just to understand my expansion. So these bearings are pressed onto this shaft. Now you can press them on or you can heat them and the bearing will expand such that it'll just drop over the top of it. And you can do this fairly cheaply. We went over to a box store and picked up I think we spent $60 on a toaster oven, and we'll show you how that'll work to do this. Now during the setup, like I said, we need to take and set this pinion depth. And to do so, we have to have different size shims that will be placed underneath between the pinion and the bearing. Now this is a brand new bearing on the tail or a headstock side of it. I'm using the exact same Timken part number bearing. This is a sacrificial one. I took a grinder and opened up this ID so it slip fits onto here. Bearing tolerances relative to the stack up here are so tight that we don't have to use the exact same bearing to get our installation done. This will mitigate us pressing this on and pressing it back off to change this shim as we need. So that's why that's done that way. I'm going to do the same thing with the bearing we just pulled out. This is the old bearing in there. I'll show you how I'll take and just grind this out until it slips fit onto here. Same idea is I can put this on. It makes the assembly mock-up procedure a lot smoother. We'll also need the pinion, the yoke. The yoke pushes on here, and we'll just get it nice snug fit. So the theory is the race that's in the housing will be nice and tight here. So it's in position in the housing, and then I can measure this back and forth. And I need to be right around 2, I think the spec on it showed plus or minus 2 thousandths. So I gotta be fairly accurate with that. Let's get this open back up. This is the new one. We want the old one. So let's open up this old one real quick. The idea is a nice little sanding roll. I'm going to take just hold it by hand, that's fine. It will not get that hot to where you can't hold it. If it does, grab a glove. Nothing YouTube likes better than slow-mo sparks. So press fit on a bearing to a shaft is typically around 2 thousandths. If you go too big, it's not a big deal in this. All we're doing is making a setup piece. So the idea is it's going to slip on nice and come back off, purely for setup. You would not want this in your final installation. All right, so now we have everything we need to get our pinion set up. Next, we need to go put these fresh races into the housing. The area it goes into, it needs to go in square and flush to the stop. So you certainly want to clean everything out, make sure there's nothing in there that's fell down, casting, whatever it might be. That looks pretty good. Of course, my part's nice and clean. Set it up in here. Well, these first couple of hits are going to be a little awkward because it's kind of going to find itself, but sounded like she hit home. Yep. Now I know it bottomed out because you can hear the pitch change. So it was a dull thud until it bottomed out. The race bottomed out to the housing. You can hear that pitch change as plain as day. I usually hit it one more time to make sure I wasn't hearing things. And of course, visually inspect it. And I'll check it from the other side as well. All right, now the other side. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. Now, if you had a question of whether you were not 100% to the stop, you certainly could go in with a small punch and hit right on the edge of this, but you better be really careful because it's real easy for that punch to skip off that short lip and then hit your bearing surface. And you could also we'll look from the other side and you can see that ledge and make sure it's up against it nice and tight. Like I said, now we're going to take and we're going to set this pinion depth. So again, from the center of the axle to the face of the pinion is our depth. This from the factory is 2.871 inches. So that's from the center line to the face. Now, first thing they'll tell you in every direction kit I've ever looked at is the question of, well, what shim should I put? Where should I start? Well, guess what? First thing I want you to do is they say, well, use what was in it. So if they're this one, you could take that all apart and figure out what shim is in there, and that'll get you awful close. That's their quote-unquote starting point. I'm going to do it a little different. Quite frankly, I went through my shim kit, and I find I have more 30,000 shim than I do anything else, so that's where I'm going to start. Now, in theory, I can just hold this. If I had somebody else, I can just hold this right here, hold tension on it. But what I'll do is actually assemble it using the yoke. Throw the washer up there. And I've cut down the nut to take away most of the retention feature, so it'll just turn on, spin on. I still have a little bit left though, so we'll have to overcome that. Take up the slack in the bearings with the nut. Right there, it's just snug, that's all I'm looking for. So the dimension I need is the face of this pinion to this surface, which is where the main caps go on, which is in the center of the bearing carrier. Now, I need to measure down like this. Of course, I'm going across at an angle, so I need to project this surface over the top of here, and so I can measure my distance correctly. Now, there are tools available that you can purchase. They range from $100. I've seen them up as far as $400. Granted, the $400 or $500 ones are a little more universal. They're going to have a bunch of mock bearings to go in here and a bunch of other stuff and fit multiple axles. And then there's also the style that just kind of bolt on here and then come across and use a dial indicator. They tend to be okay. And but what I've always found is that a simple piece of steel, and in this case I'm actually going to use this surface, but a simple piece of steel bolted up that is flat and is solid. This is a 3/8 chunk of steel. Okay. And I'm going to tighten this down so it's not wobbling around. Now you're going to say, all right, well, how do I get the measurement? You said you have to measure from the bearing cap to the pinion. That's 100% correct. But you can do a little math, and if you measure, so now I'm going to measure the pinion relative to this surface down to the pinion face, but what I'm going to do then is subtract the distance from here to there. And on a pair of calipers, you have the function to 0. So you can put this in any position, hit your 0 button, and then anything after that will automatically do your math for you. Now the only problem with this using as a depth gauge, you have a very small surface area to locate off of, so it's critical that you feel the flatness. And I tend to measure it multiple times and get a repeatable number. 185.86. So yeah. So I'm going to take and 0 this at 186. Now I can come into this hole, do the exact same thing down to the pinion. And I got 2.88, call it 4. I think my number was 71. So I need to add about 12 thousandths shim underneath that bearing to bring the pinion face this way. 185.86. So yeah. So I'm going to take and 0 this at 186. Now I can come into this hole, do the exact same thing down to the pinion. And I got 2.88, call it 4. I think my number was 71. So I need to add about 12 thousandths shim underneath that bearing to bring the pinion face this way. But I'm going to recheck it a couple more times. So I'm going to add 12 thousandths to that. Hopefully my kit has all those. It should. I need a total of, yeah, it's basically 30, 29. So I need somewhere around 40, basically call it 41. If I can get to 41. All right, so I need 41, 42, somewhere in that range. This is 21 thou. This is 21 thou. Let's stack these puppies together. I get 42 thou. Perfect. Let's try that. Look at that. 2.870, we need 2.871. Spec says within 2 thousandths. So that's money right there. So now we know we have our pinion shim. We know what it is. Now we're going to take back over to our table. We need to get the new bearing put on there with the shim in the way, and then it's ready to be installed into the housing for good. All right, now we have our pinion bearings set. We know what shim we need, but note that I have other bearings on here, right? And I have a mess of shims. Before you take this off, do yourself a favor, get the other shims out of the way so you do not mix them up. And secondly, you'll notice that I've also marked my bearings with a marker so I knew which ones were the used bearings or the ones with the open hole. Not that you wouldn't realize it when you go to press them on, but now is also a good time to get these out of the way so you do not mix them up with the brand new stuff. So here's our two brand new bearings. The one that has to get pressed on is the larger one. For that, I'm gonna put it over here in our fancy little toaster oven that we got. You can see it's brand new, sparkling. We've yet to have any pizza in it, which we will. Take and put this all the way up on 450, and I'm gonna do broil, even though it has a turbo function, which seems to be really cool. Give it about, I'm gonna give it 20 minutes. That'd be more than plenty of time. So we'll let that heat up. It's gonna get nice and hot. As soon as that goes off, I'll grab it with some gloves, bring it over here, and it'll slide right on down to home. Now, before I do that, I do want to remember to put a little bit of grease right here on this area because it will help that bearing to slide, mainly because steel against steel tends to drag a little bit, and when that is hot, it's going to start cooling, and I want to make sure I get it down on there all the way, right away, and any little binding is going to cause it to hold up and then basically not go on all the way like I want it to. Now, you certainly can take and put the pinion into the freezer. It will also shrink the diameter. It will definitely help on the assembly. And so the cold shaft and the hot bearing, it'll increase that clearance and everything will just glide down. And then you just let it room temperature back to normal ambient and it'll cinch itself on there nicely. While we're waiting for that to heat up, onto the ring gear and the carrier. Now, this is a brand new ring gear. One of the things they always advise is to run a small file over this area. This is the surface it's going to set against here. You want to make sure there's no burrs, no nothing on here because you want that to sit down flat. I'm just going to take a flat file. Again, just making sure there's no burrs. Obviously the surface isn't, it has a little higher edges here, but it looks pretty good. Now, obviously the ring gear goes in this direction. Bring it down. What I like to do is take one of the screws, put it up in here, because once it's pushed down, there's a slight bit of interference or at least location to this. And sometimes they don't like to rotate once they're on that location. So to make things easier, I'm gonna flip this over. And what I'm trying to accomplish is lining up the bolt holes. 2 is enough to locate it around the radius. So that pushed down in there, and then now it's located on center to the center of the rotation of the bearings. Okay, now I am going to just tighten these up just so they're snug, and I can see that we're going to have fun with these bolts. These are not going to work. You can see that the recess in the carrier is not quite large enough in diameter for my socket to fit down in there, nice and tight, but the head of the bolt is just proud enough to grab it. And there are no washers that go with this. The bolts all get Loctited, put Loctite on the threads and then thread in, and then of course torque to, I think it's 60 foot-pounds. So we'll see if we have an issue there. If we do, all we'll need to do is get some different bolts. It's not the end of the world. It'll just be one more day that it sits on the rack and waits. So this morning we got some fresh bolts, and you can see these are quite a bit different head size. These ARPs will go in here and clear. I'll have plenty of room as far as the socket is concerned. I'm surprised that the shoulder is a little bit smaller, but at the same time, this is what ARP does. I'm sure they're right. So now, let's get some Loctite on these bolts and get this buttoned up. Torque on these is according to ARP's number, is 55 foot-pounds. Now to get this torque down, I'm not going to be able to hold this at 55 foot-pounds, so I'm going to take it over and set it in the vise. You can see I put some towels on here to kind of protect some things. And I'm going to use the windows a little bit to hold it. And I'm not going to pinch this tight. That's just going to be snug enough to hold it from spinning. Now I still use this, you take these to 55 foot-pounds, I'm going to increment it up. I'm going to go to 30 and then 55 and use a star pattern to pull the gear up. So alternate around. Our ring gear is now installed onto the carrier. This is ready to go into the axle housing now. Last thing I need to do is get the bearing out of the toaster oven there and get it put onto the pinion. There. Just like it's supposed to go. Just like that. That simple. Put it on there. You notice I grabbed it and moved it as fast as I could because as it's coming from here to there, it's cooling. It only needs to change by about 2/1000ths and it will not go on that shaft without a press. But when I dropped it down, you can hear it clank. I know it's seated at the very end. I'm going to let this cool and then we're going to get it into the axle. Okay, so we're all ready to install the pinion. I'm going to put a little more oil than what I already have on here. And that way, when it's installed, it already has some lube on the bearings themselves. And also, I'm going to be checking the torque that it requires to rotate the pinion when it's installed. That needs to be on new bearings, is like 25 inch-pounds. So that's why I want to make sure I got lube on there so it rotates smoothly. So I need to put the front bearing in first and then the seal. That captures everything. Now I have a high-tech block of wood here. It's going to work perfectly, hopefully without splitting. Because you want to drive the seal evenly if at all possible here. We wanted to highlight a little issue here we ran into directly with the seal. And in '69, there's actually two seals and they carried it on for X amount of years. But there was two seals, one for the truck and one for the car. And the snout on the housing is slightly different, and that's why there was two different seals in the inset where the sealing surface is at. Now, what's happened is the car seal, for whatever reason, has been discontinued, and the only one available now is the truck seal. Typically speaking, your pinion bearing here should be free floating by about, say, at least a 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch, somewhere in that ballpark. And what I caught was this doesn't have any when the seal is installed fully like it's supposed to be, where this surface hits the surface of the housing. Now the sealing surface to the yoke is right up here. And at this point, that's in the chamfer. So I can install this, everything will go together, but this will leak fluid like crazy. Kind of like it's witnessed up here. So to come over here on the workbench, I've done a little homework. I've come up with these 3 different seals that are of 3 different manufacturers. This one happened to be in our initial kit, and these are 2 other aftermarket, a Timken and a SKF. But the point is all 3 of these are slightly different, but none of them will actually function the way they're supposed to if fully installed. And you can see a good witness of that. So here's your sealing surface on the yoke, and it has this chamfer that's roughly 1/8 of an inch. If I put this on here, I'll flip this over so you can see it. That sealing surface, the ridge, and I'll pull it back, the ridge that actually seals is not on the large diameter of the yoke. It's still riding on the chamfered edge. So yes, it'll go on there. It has a marginal seal relative to the dust side of things, but not on the grease seal side. So this will install, everything will go together like I showed you over in the axle, but this is still going to leak. Now, what I found is you can do 3 different things. You can install this and not install it fully, so you would leave a gap. Now, in my opinion, that leaves for a lot of margin of error because it's easy to have it rocked inside the housing slightly. The second area is you could take a piece of welding rod. This happens to be a little small, but the point is the same. Use a, say an 1/8 inch welding rod, bend it up and slip it over the top of this. Now you have a firm stop and you'll have a gap when you're done. And then the third option, and which I think is probably the best option, is actually a solid ring. I happen to machine this out of a piece of steel I had laying around, and luckily I have access to a lathe. And this will go in here then and act as a physical stop. That'll give me an 1/8 inch of a gap. And if you can see here, now my 1/8 inch forces that sealing ring up onto the sealing surface. I'm sure somebody's out there thinking, boy, that sure is a hack way to install that. And that's probably right. But at the same token, it is the only way to do it because there are no seals available that brings this sealing surface toward the yoke further. They're all inset like this. So the only way to do it is to short install it. If you have an aftermarket housing, for instance, like a Mosier or a Strange, they've actually increased the length on that casting, and it gets away with that. So it's only on the stock 12-bolt housings from GM that are short, that needed that longer, call it longer seal this way to install these correctly and make a good seal. So now that we know what our problem is, let's get this seal back out of the way and put our spacer in with a fresh seal. C'est la vie. Our spacer and our seal, like so. Fancy installer. It might explode because it is wood. Ah, look at that. Now it actually has some float like it should. And you can see I have a gap between the face of the bearing to the sealing surface. Problem solved. All right, so my bearing is lubed up a little bit. Now I need to put the crush sleeve on. This is going to maintain a preload between the bearings. And now I can slip this up inside of here. It will not go in all the way yet because that bearing has a little bit of press fit. I like to use a little of this sealer on the splines, and all this is going to do is stop any kind of seepage, if you will, of gear lube coming up the splines. Okay, that allows me to have some thread hanging out. The nut has a kind of a crush or pinch nut on the top. I still put just a pinch of blue Loctite on it. Washer, and it's not going to have quite enough. Not enough thread showing right now, so I'm just going to take and knock that in there a little bit. Now the nuts start on there. Now the pinion torque is not in your traditional sense, meaning torque the pinion nut to 255 foot-pounds and you're done. What you're going to do is you're going to torque this nut so it sufficiently compresses that spacer, the crush sleeve that's in there, so then you have a rotational torque of 25 to 30 inch-pounds on a new bearing. If you have a used bearing for some reason, that's going to be closer to like 15. But on a new bearing, you're 50 or 25 to 30, so that's the next step here. You're not going to be able to hold this by hand unless you're the Hulk himself. So I picked up this $13 tool from All Star. It has multiple holes in it, and you see it has 2 square drives. I'll be able to use this smaller 1/2-inch square drive. Just use a couple of the yoke bolts and some washers if needed. I'll be able to hold this with a breaker bar, and then I can get I'm actually going to use a torque wrench up in the center of this and use them together to tighten up this nut, not using an impact. So breaker bar on there. Now I am going to set this to a number just so I know where I'm at. It's going to take at least 150 and probably a whole lot more, but. All right, breaker bar is on here. I'm going to rotate this up. Now obviously I can use anything on the body that's secure or anything on the car that's secure to help hold this torque, or I should be able to hold it by myself. But here I can run it up against the leaf spring and give me a hand with it. This is going to be wobbly until you take up the slack. This is like the butterfly exercise at the gym. If you go to the gym, that's what I've heard. So like I said, there's 150, and I still have a lot of slop. Now, please notice that I have this up on a hoist. I should not be able to move the car with a breaker bar on this yoke. But if you're on a set of jack stands, you better be careful. Okay, now I have no slop. However, I know, at least by feel, that is not 25 inch-pounds. That's probably closer to 1 or 2. It's just barely dragging. So I need to take this part slow, go incremental turns. Okay. Now to do this, you could certainly use a clicker wrench set at 25. I happen to have the luxury of having a digital. Again, I'm looking for 25 to 30. And that is about 13. Look at that. 29. We'll take it. Next step now is to come up to this side of things and get the carrier with the ring gear up into the hole and start setting that backlash right to left. So I have a little Axe oil here on my bearings, and I've also taken and put a little L and an R on the bearing cups. And the idea is they should be left with their mating bearing, and at some point I'm going to drop these, so we'll see it. Oh, she fits up in here now. It's going to roll up into your carrier spot. Now this is where I'm going to take and set my lash. So like I said, I'm going to use these spacers. I'm going to start with the ones that were in it, the factory ones. Set that in there. Slide everything all the way to the other way. Now this may or may not fit. and that's fine if it doesn't. I have a whole brand new shim pack. Yeah, that's gonna be too tight. Now our bearing kit here has, or our shim kit has one bearing that has this shoulder into it, as you can see. The idea behind that is now I can take and pack my thin shims to the center, put a larger shim on the outside to help protect them. And as I tap this in, it'll give me a means of not booger up the thin ones. Get something up in there. All right. So the idea here is I have some shims over here, and you can see, I mean, it doesn't take much to figure out that's a lot more than 9/1000ths. I'm just, right now, I'm just pushing everything into this bearing and rotating the ring gear. So this is certainly a educated trial and error, meaning I'm going to take and keep adding shims to this pack until it tightens up. I believe if I'm up against that one, then I'm dead solid. So I need a little
shim over here to push this way. And you can do it from either direction. So I can shim from this side to rough get my lash, or I could shim from this side to rough get my lash. All depends on which way you want to do it. So I have a little bit of a shim in here. You can just see it's about a 20,000 shim between the factory one and the housing. And that's gotten me pretty close. That's a whole lot better than what we started with. Now to accurately measure that, you'll need a dial indicator. And it's just that plunger, little dial. As it moves, you can measure you get a number. You want to set your dial indicator on here as straight as possible, meaning you're not getting some weird angle. So you're not hitting it here. You want to hit it as perpendicular to the gear as possible. And I say as possible because I only have so much room. You have to measure it one way or the other. Now, I'm perpendicular to the face of the tooth. Don't confuse that with perpendicular or tangent to the radius. So with that, just a quick check. So I'll zero this out. Just to have an even number. So I'm at 20 there, putting a little light load. So all I'm doing is I'm forcing contact to one side of the tooth surface of the ring gear and the pinion as they made up. And now I'm just going to the back side of that. And it gives me, right now I got 13/1000ths. Now, after having the carrier in and out about 20 times, I finally got to the point where I have my shims where I like them. So what I did is I took shims all the way out, got the gear in to where I had no lash. I got to like 2/1000ths, and then I slowly incremented it that way. Now you have to keep the left side tight. So every time let's say you add 10/1000ths here, you need to subtract 10/1000ths over here, and vice versa. So as I pushed it away, I kept moving shims around until I got to the point where my spec is 7 and 9 for a street gear, and moving this, I have 8, which from a tolerance standpoint, you don't get any better than that. Next step is going to be, I'm going to tighten these caps down a little bit more. All right, now I have them snugged up, but now I need to take and check my gear pad, or my tooth pattern. To do that, I use this paint right here. In fact, I'll paint it on right now. So you just take some of this paint, and this washes right off. You don't have to even remove it. The gear lube will take care of it later. But you paint a couple of the teeth, and you're looking for the contact patch. If you look through your gear assembly instructions, your installation instructions, it'll show you that you want to have, the pattern should be centered top to bottom, and it's kind of centered front to back, but a little bit closer to the bottom than to the top. Not much. That's part of that wear-in that they did at the factory. So let's get this out of the way. Like I said, I want to put just a pinch more torque on here. And I'm not doing my final assembly, I'm still doing mock-up. Because I'm still gonna pull the carrier out, and I'll add 10 thousandths more shim here than I have here to put that preload on the bearing pack. All right, with that, come up on this side, and I'm just spinning the gear. Hold a little pressure on there. You can start to see the pattern I'm getting. So the pattern is on the front third of the tooth, but you see it stops way down here at the edge. It's fairly centered. It looks pretty good. It's not too tall. It doesn't seem to be too short, but I'm going to double check that to the other. And you can also see the mating surface here. Now, the pinion depth, if that's dead perfect and your gear lash is set, of course gear lash is just relative to a little bit so the gear doesn't bind. Your pinion depth is really what sets this tooth pattern. And at this point, it doesn't look too terribly bad. I don't see that it's off. Obviously, I can't put true torque on it, so I can't get it to flatten out way back in here, but you can see where the pattern looks good through here. It's not going to grow towards the front. It's only going to grow towards the back. All right, so to make it a little clearer, here's the directions and here's what the correct load pattern looks like. Now this is the inside, this is the outside, so let's flip it over so we can see it right. All right, so you can see on the this would be the drive side. See, it's pushed towards the front, but not all the way. The contact isn't as long as it shows in that picture, but we're certainly in call it the, if you divide this into fifths, you're in your front fifth, so to speak. Not directly in half and not really a third, so it's shifted just a little bit towards the front. Now if you look at the coach side of the gear, right here, see we're pretty good. It's nice and tight. This is probably a good one to look at. So you got, it's almost centered like it shows in this diagram, okay? The biggest thing for wine is certainly setting the pinion depth correct. We have that pinion depth right on. This is just kind of a double check to make sure something's just not crazy. I don't know, you mismeasured it, I guess. So I think our depth and tooth pattern looks pretty good. You can see even in the inside as it's hitting the pinion, you know, what that looks like in there. That should also have a nice long pattern. It shouldn't be all the way to the toe and not all the way to the heel. At this point, we're ready to pull the caps back off real quick, put a 10 thousandths shim in here, and that's just to preload those bearings, the carrier bearings, and then we'll put the caps on for the final time, torque it down nice and tight. I'll put 30 on the top one, 30 on the bottom one, same thing here, and then I'll do 50, so they'll torque down even. All right, now after you have everything all torqued down, rotate your pinion a couple times all the way around, and then throw your dial indicator on there one last time. Oh, it's perfect. Right on the money. So now simply take the axles, put them right back in like you took them out. Line it up with the spline. Now, I don't have the cross pin out, so they're not going to go in all the way yet. Grab this side. Same thing. With this cross bolt in here, I'm going to pull this out. Now, as you rotate the carrier, you have to be a little careful. And we'll probably have to persuade this a little bit because it's from the factory. A little gook in there. All right, so there's the pin out of the way, just like the factory one was. Now I'm just going to reach over and push the axles in all the way. Take my C-clip, a little magnet, and reach that up into there. May have to work things around a little bit. So now that's up in its slot. Pull the axle back out. That one's installed. Same thing over in this end. Put this back in. You can bring this in from the top or the bottom, doesn't matter. The key is you have to line this hole up with the hole in the case. I'm going to go from the top since that's where I'm angled at. Now we may have to fight this just a little bit to line that pin back up because I might not have got that quite right. If you do, just take and push it back and forth until you get it right. It's no big deal. Don't take and slam a hammer in here. This bolt has a little star washer on it to hold the torque. This does not get torqued a ton. It's in the inch-pounds range. It's a small bolt. But if you forget to torque it and it comes out, it will jam against here and you'll have a bad day. That's good there. Now, if we look at our axle ends, both axles will be turning now. So now, does our left side turn when our right side's turning? That answer should be yes. And we no longer will have a one-wheel peel. Okay. Put the cover back on. I'm going to put a little silicone on this seal. This is a cork seal with a steel center. These are the best ones to use. The cover will only go on one way. Eyebrow up, and then locate your holes. These bolts are all exactly the same except for one. The one's a little bit longer and usually has a washer, rotating washer on it. And that goes clear up here in this spot. The reason this is longer because you have a tab that goes on over top of the cover as well. So it adds that little bit of thickness, and they gave a little bit longer bolt to hold it down. So right here. All right, so we're gonna get this buttoned up. We're gonna put fluid in it. The fluid fills over here on this side. Fill it up until it starts coming back out of that hole. And put our brake drums back on, wheels back down. I guess before we throw wheels on this and fit it on the ground, we probably should put the drive shaft back in too. Now we're gonna run this for about 20 miles, nice and easy, meaning just normal type of driving. And then we're gonna let it cool back to ambient. The reason you're doing that is you're seating parts, just like breaking in an engine. So tomorrow, we'll leave it set for 24 hours. Tomorrow, then we'll take it for a good spin, if you know what I mean. So the other side of changing your gears, you're probably going to change your speedometer reading. So I'm using the GPS here, just on my phone, and it reads we're running about 55 miles an hour, but my speedometer now reads at about 68. It wasn't right before. It's certainly not going to get any better right now, but we may need to change the rear tires as it is because the ones that are on this are pretty small. So when you're finally done, you know what gear you have, you know your height of your tire, then make your gear change in your speedometer. It's really simple, just in the tail shaft of the transmission. Doesn't matter if it's an automatic or a manual. Just pull it out, put the new one in, and that'll recalibrate your speedometer. Tomorrow morning we'll hop in this and see if we fix that one wheel peel issue.
Let's see if we fix that broken leg. All right, looks like we fixed that one wheel peel and our fresh gear is in. So this project's a wrap. However, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. We'll do the best we can to answer them. Click and subscribe. Most importantly, get out there and enjoy the road.